Hello, and welcome to week 5 of Mondays with Miss E. I'm going to be reading 3 chapters this week. I will start, as I've done the last couple of weeks, with my book-related t-shirt. This week I have got on a cool Volkswagen Bus t-shirt that I picked up in Acadia. How is that book-related? Well, if you take a look at my second book, Cross Country. Pretty much the whole book takes place in a VW camper. So that's why I consider this one of my book t-shirts. And I actually put a link in the video to a cool Volkswagen camper that we rented last year and went camping in. So you can check that out. All right, so last week we left off, Bets had just figured out that the picture on Mr. Flynn's wall was Amelia Earhart, and then kind of put the pieces together and figured out that Miss E, who she had been delivering groceries to, was in fact Amelia Earhart. And we kind of just left it at that, her figuring that out. So we're going to pick up this week with that. A couple things before I start. It was really interesting to research Amelia Earhart, and I knew before I started writing that I really needed to learn as much as I could about her. If I was going to write her as a character and create her as a character, I really felt like I needed to know what she was like as a real person. So I spent a lot of time researching before I started writing, and thankfully, Amelia Earhart wrote several books about herself. And about her life. So not only could I read information about her, but I was reading something that's very much written in her voice, and so it gave me a really good sense of her as a person. And I feel like of everything I read about her, that was some of the most useful, some of the more useful book. The thing that sealed the deal, though, was her eyes. They were the same 30 years later, still squinting like she was looking for something on a sunset horizon. What I wasn't sure of was why a world-famous aviator, women's rights advocate, and university faculty member would choose to disappear after nearly completing a flight around the world and then hide out in the middle of nowhere for 30 years. When I wasn't daydreaming in school or delivering groceries, I busied myself with reading the other 2 biographies. They both contained pretty much the same information, but I still read them both, cover to cover. I learned about her childhood and had a good laugh picturing Miss E rumbling down the makeshift wooden ramp she'd built in her backyard when she was denied a ride on a roller coaster at the World's Fair. I read about her early days of flying, when keeping an airplane in the air was mostly about luck and fearlessness, and I learned the details of her many record-breaking flights, not just the Atlantic crossing and the world flight, but her other firsts. New fact, I couldn't help but wonder why most people only knew about the last event in her life. It seemed to me that Amelia Earhart put more into the first 40 years of her life than most people put into 80 or 90, which added to the puzzle. Why call it all off at 40? She had a husband, a successful career, and was doing something she'd yearned to do since childhood, fly. My 15-year-old brain couldn't wrap itself around what could be missing from her life that would prompt her to ditch it all for a farm in nowhere, California. As I biked from school to Johnson's Wednesday afternoon, I was determined to find out. I tumbled into the store and eagerly looked around for the delivery box. "Nothing today, Elizabeth," Mr. Johnson said from behind the counter. Go and enjoy the afternoon. Looks like you've got the day off. I stood, puzzled, for a moment, questions half formed in my mouth, until I finally got the words out. What about Miss E? She's a Wednesday delivery. Not this week. She didn't call and order anything for today. He lifted his paper, signaling that the conversation was over and leaving me to read the front page headline for an article on the anti-war movement that was gathering steam in San Francisco. I dragged myself outside and made it to a bench near the bulletin board. The excitement that had built up over the last week was emptying onto the sidewalk. Why would she stop her grocery delivery? Was she just going back to her old habit, or did she not want to see me? Had she found out that I had learned her secret? Or was she concerned I would figure things out if she allowed me to keep visiting? The excitement that had left me was gradually replaced with anger. She was messing with me. First, she started having her groceries delivered, so I had to go out to her farm. She left that envelope like she was some kind of hermit who couldn't even greet me at the door to pay for her. At 15, I hadn't had a real boyfriend yet, but if I had, I would have compared the whole thing to a breakup. And if this were a breakup, there would have been an angry note stuck in a locker door demanding an explanation. I decided to do the next best thing. I tossed my backpack into my basket and hopped on my bike. I pedaled the miles out to Miss E's farm easily now. The months of delivering had really gotten me into shape. And the ride that took me the better part of the afternoon, I could now do in what felt like minutes. The farm was quiet as usual when I got there, but the red pickup was parked in front of the house. When I saw it, a thought came to me that I hadn't had before, and for a moment I was concerned. What if something had happened to Miss E? She lived out here all by herself and could be sick or hurt. But when I reached the door, I heard the familiar music and could see movement inside the dim living room. I rapped on the door hard enough to bounce it in its frame, but I wanted to be sure she heard me. I didn't wait for a reply. I pulled the 3 library books out of my backpack and dropped them on the porch in front of the door. Chew on that, Mealy, I mumbled as I stomped back to my bike. All right. So that chapter was called Questions, and the next chapter is called Answers. This is a chapter that I really kind of struggled with. This is where we find out why Miss E is on this farm, why she left, she didn't complete her world flight, and why she's been hiding out on this farm all these years. And this is certainly the part where the information on the real Amelia Earhart kind of gets mixed in with the made-up Miss E, the made-up character of Miss E. And even though I was writing fiction and even though I was making this story up, I really felt like I needed an explanation that would fit with the real part of Miss E. I didn't want an explanation I wanted an explanation that was believable. And so I struggled a little bit with that to find something that would fit with the real life Amelia Earhart, but also kind of work with this made up story. And I wrote this chapter and rewrote this chapter several times to try to get something that was a good fit for the story and allowed me to kind of create this character that had hidden herself away for years, but at the same time would do justice to the real Amelia Earhart and be at least kind of believable to the reality of Amelia Earhart. All right, so this chapter is called Answers. Another thing I really struggled with this chapter is that it is almost all Miss E speaking, and most of the book Miss E is it's stuff that happens, stuff that Bets does, and stuff that's happening to her, and a lot of her thinking and processing what's going on around her. And this chapter really stands out as just a lot of speech, a lot of dialogue, and it's not even two-way dialogue. It's a lot of Miss E just talking. So writing this, that was something as well that I really kind of had to pay attention to, because it was different than the chapters that I had written before, and where the chapters before were a lot of Bets's thoughts. I really kind of had to shift my writing and make sure that I was writing in Miss E's voice instead of Bet's. So that's another thing that for me stands out with this chapter. Answers. There was an order for groceries the following Wednesday. I arrived at the house half expecting there to be another envelope on the screen door, and was relieved when there wasn't. I knocked and heard Miss E's voice calling from the kitchen. I walked past the photographs again, scanning the wall for ones I now recognized from the books I'd read. Miss E was seated at the kitchen table, just as she had been 2 weeks earlier. This time, though, there were 2 mugs of tomato juice, and the 3 library books sat in a neat stack between them. Looks like these are due next week, Bets. Best take them back with you so you don't get any fines. I set the box down on the kitchen cupboard and slid cautiously into a chair when Miss E gestured toward it. Like the envelope that wasn't on the door, I was expecting a confrontation that didn't come. My head was full of questions again, but Miss E started talking and didn't stop for a long time, so I just listened and kept my mouth shut, except for the times that it hung open in surprise. There's a long story to be told here, Bets, so make yourself comfortable and drink your tomato. First Atlantic crossing. I wasn't even flying the plane then, just a passenger, but everyone was paying attention because I was the first woman ever to do it. Seems funny now, like giving the spotlight to the first woman to ride a bus or a taxi cab. I must have reacted to her using the word spotlight, thinking of how hard I'd tried to avoid attention at school, because she noticed it and raised an eyebrow. Well, when I got off that plane, there was a mighty big spotlight, she continued, and I wasn't expecting it. I only made the flight because I was excited about the adventure, and I figured afterwards I'd go back to my life, the same as it was before. But once I stepped onto the ground in England, everything changed. Should have figured it with the newspaper connections George Putnam had, but I didn't. Funny thing about the spotlight, though, once you're in it, you start to forget what things were like before. You get used to the attention. You start thinking about things you can do to keep that attention. Don't get me wrong, Bets. I'm a flyer. Any flight I made, I did because I simply loved being in the air. But talking to reporters before I left and smiling for photographers once I was back on the ground started to feel like that was part of flying too. Well, I guess I liked the attention enough to marry a publicist. And sometimes a spotlight can get put to good use. With so many people paying attention to me for the flying I did, I had a good stage for talking about some of the other things that were important to me. But the spotlight gets tiresome. Reaction. Come on, Bets. You read those books, so you must know something about that marriage. George Putnam was a good man, and he adored me. But women who want to settle down to a domestic life in their husband's home don't usually spend their married years crisscrossing the globe on solo flights. Anyone on the outside must have figured George and I had a pretty good life. Beautiful home, showing up at fancy parties, driving around in shiny cars. But I had enough of it all, enough of George and enough of the spotlight. So a flight around the world seemed like a pretty good idea. Sure, I agreed to write about it, and George was sitting back home, eagerly awaiting any dispatches I sent him. I knew there'd be a big crowd waiting for me back in Oakland, but look at that map of my route, and you'll find lots of out-of-the-way places, where sometimes the welcome wagon was just a few men waiting to fill the tanks and check the flaps. I guess I was hoping for something different. When I returned, I hinted to a reporter that I'd be done with long distance flying, stunt flying, they still called it back then, made him promise not to write a word about it until I was close to finishing the flight. But I knew things wouldn't change just because I wanted them to. Had a friend in California, name of Sam Casey. Well, more than an old friend, I suppose. There were other romances before George, of course, and Sam was one of them. Sam was a sailor and spent most of his time on a ship in the Pacific. While the Navy kept an eye on Japan, we weren't at war yet in 37, but with Japan and Germany flexing their muscles, we knew that's where we were headed. I stayed in touch with Sam after I married, a letter now and then, or a visit when I was in California and he was on leave. It was harmless bets. George knew all about it and didn't trouble himself over it. He certainly wasn't going to stop a grown woman from seeing an old friend. It was Sam who put the idea in my head. This farm was his, and he'd joke sometimes about me taking a wrong turn on one of my flights and landing here, away from the crowds in the spotlight. I didn't plan to slip away, not at first, but the farther away from my life back home, the more the idea wound into my thoughts. Flying seems like a whole lot of doing nothing sometimes, Bets. Oh, there's the takeoff and the landing, but between them, you're just pointing your plane in a straight line and looking out ahead at the horizon. There's lots of time to think, and I found myself thinking more and more about Sam Casey's farm. Missy paused for a long time. I sipped my tomato juice uncomfortably, waiting for her to start again, not knowing if I should say something or if she'd reached the end of the story and I just hadn't figured it out. Finally, she let out a long sigh and started talking. I realized wanting to run away from the spotlight was only half of it, Bets, and it's the worst half. It wasn't until I was almost done with my world flight before I figured out what I wanted to run to. I got word to Sam what I was thinking, and he started preparing for my arrival on the farm while folks down in Oakland were gearing up for the same. All that was left was to convince my navigator, because if I was going to disappear, I certainly couldn't have Fred Noonan showing up at the airport. I thought I'd have a hard time of it, but Fred took to the idea right away. Fred had bounced around a lot. Just say that the Pacific's a mighty big place, and it's easy to get lost if a person wants to. They were looking for us on one tiny speck of an island, and we flew to another, and another, and another. Wasn't any trouble landing here without being seen. Map was different back then. Not as many people, only a few farms. Town was not much more than a place where two roads bumped together. By the time the ship stopped searching the ocean for me, I was sitting cozily on this farm. She must have seen the discomfort on my face. I don't take it lightly what I did. I can talk about it easier now, 30 years later, but there were lots of nights I cried myself to sleep, thinking I'd done the wrong thing and wondering if there was any way I could undo it. Fooling the whole world might feel like a fun thing to think about, but actually doing it is another story. And playing dead for a husband, well, how do you undo that? George was always going to love me more than I was going to love him, and maybe he was better off without me in the end. I was only part wife for him anyway. The rest of me was just someone for him to publish and promote. But I left friends and family and a home and a life too. You've seen all I've got left hanging on the wall in my hallway. That was the hardest part. There was another long pause. This time, I didn't sit there wondering if the story was done, because I knew it wasn't, and I had the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Missy sat for a while and sipped her tomato juice a few times. I tried to picture her flying her airplane with a thermos full of tomato juice on the seat next to her, and I imagined her reaching for it without looking, like my father reaches for his coffee while he's reading the paper. Your father's in Vietnam, Bets? Her question brought me back from my daydream and reminded me that there was a world outside Missy's kitchen. I opened my mouth to answer, but felt like it still wasn't my turn to speak and just nodded instead. Wars. We keep having them, though. We keep having them, even though it seems like while we're in one, all we want to do is get out of it. We don't ever learn the lesson, though. I settled in on Sam's farm, but most of the time, I was here on my own. A letter would come now and then, and there were times he was home on leave. We'd stay here mostly. We didn't dare go anywhere we'd see too many people for fear someone would recognize me. But we'd take lots of drives on roads that wouldn't show up on most maps. And if you've got to stay in one place, a farm's just about the best place to do it. It was those times that Sam was here that I was most happiest. He became a best friend. Well, with me mostly hiding away, he was the only one I had, but still the best I could have ever hoped for. With Sam, talking and laughing were easy, and there was never anything more important than the moment we were in and the place where we were. That's just about all anyone could ask for in a friend. The times in between, the times when he was gone, that's when I couldn't help but think about the decision I'd made, wondering if it was the right one and feeling the dread of knowing that there was no going back. Well, you've read enough of your history book to know that things went from bad to worse with Japan and the Pacific. And before too long, everyone in a uniform was shipping out. So we were back to just letters again, some from islands I'd flown to. Then the letters stopped. Of course, you hope at first that it's just the mail. You tell yourself that ships can take weeks to get into a port with mail service. But then one day, a shiny black car came down the road, and I knew before it even stopped in front of the house. I wasn't a military wife, so there was no officer coming to give me his sympathy in a folded up flag. Instead, a lawyer came up to the door with a briefcase full of papers. There was a quick quiver in her voice. Damp eyes were brushed dry, and I thought for a second that the emotion in Miss E's story would start to flow from her. But then she turned it off like flipping a switch, and in that brief second, she reminded me of my mother. Well, Sam was gone, and that was that. Killed in some battle near Saipan. Military doesn't send condolence letters to women who are just hiding out on a soldier's farm instead of being married to them. But Sam had written a will before he left, and the farm went to me, legal, signed and sealed. He didn't have any other close family, so I suppose if he hadn't put things down in writing, everything would have gone to the state, and I would have been looking for a place to park my plane. I was slumped down in my chair, still sorting through the story she just told me. I was exhausted, and I imagined Miss E felt the same, but I knew I had to listen to the end. Where could I go? George had already remarried, and I wouldn't have gone back to him even if he wasn't. Would he have wanted me? The world had moved on too. War had come and gone, and people were going someplace new. What did they need with a woman pilot from a decade ago? And how could I just reappear, explaining why I'd done what I'd done? So I just planted myself on this farm. I didn't get what I wanted, but I at least got rid of what I didn't want. No spotlight out here, huh, Bets? She smiled a little, then stood up and took her mug to the sink, her tomato juice apparently finished along with her story. So here I am. I let it all sink in. I looked at the books on the table and thought about the person they described, and then the person in front of me with a story that would rewrite everything that was in all the books. It was the kind of story that would make for a scandalous magazine headline until you had a chance to sit down in that person's kitchen, drink some tomato juice with her, and hear her side of it. When I finally found my voice, I only had one question left. Where's the plane? All right. One more chapter for today, and sticking with my short, mostly one-word chapter titles. This one is called Electra. This is a chapter. There were a couple scenes in Miss E when I first started thinking about the story and first planning it out. were a couple scenes that I knew were going to happen right from the start, and this was one of them. The scene where Bets gets to see Miss E's plane, and this is certainly an iconic airplane. There's a Amelia Earhart, the plane that Amelia Earhart flew solo in across the Atlantic is in the Smithsonian Museum. Her Lockheed Electra is missing. No one knows where it is. People have searched and people have theories. They've searched islands. They're playing this scene over and over in my mind about what it would be like for Bets to finally discover and see this plane that so many people have been searching for. So here it is, Electra. Miss E grabbed the handle of the door on the left and put her weight into pulling it. I realized I should help her, but before I had a chance, the heavy wooden door slid open on rusty rollers above, and Miss E was already pushing the other one open. The scene inside was so different from the sunlit world around me that it was like looking into an old photograph. The barn was absolute stillness. All the colors, muted browns and yellows. Hay dust hung in the air, caught in the shafts of sunlight that snuck through the cracks in the barn siding. The stalls all stood empty, but they looked just as they would have the last time the barn held animals. Piles of hay lay in the corners, ropes and feed bags still hung on hooks. A tractor hulked far back in the barn, and a plow beside it waited to be pulled through the fields. The plane stood in the middle of the large space, looking both out of place and perfectly natural at the same time. It had no business being there among the animal stalls and farm equipment, yet everything in the scene seemed to be from the same time, as if the door was shut in 1937 and was just now being opened again. Miss E paused in the doorway for a moment, looking at the plane. She walked toward it, turning briefly to look at me in a way that gave me permission to follow. I stepped through the doorway and was hit by a wall of heat and the smell of hay, like the air too had been trapped in the barn for years. Miss E walked around the plane, and I followed at a distance. She touched parts of it. As she came close, a wingtip, South America or Africa, getting ready to fly to her next destination. The plane was old with the abuse of many miles, the metal surrounding the engines blackened by heat and oil, the skin scratched and worn, and the seams filled with the dust of endless airfields. But if it looked any other way, it would have seemed wrong. If it were shiny and new, I would have been disappointed. Here was the plane that had been lost at sea or on some deserted island, so everybody thought. Here it was after all those years. Why shouldn't it look like it had been around the world and back again? It had. Not in a museum, Miss E's voice interrupted my thoughts. Don't have to just stand there looking. I turned to see her opening a door in the side of the plane and ducking her head as she crawled in. I followed, putting my hands on either side of the door and pulling myself through it. Like the barn, the inside of the plane looked as if it hadn't been touched in 30 years. We squeezed between the large tanks of fuel. I knew from reading the Amelia Earhart books that they had been installed to increase the plane's range, and eventually came to the cockpit. Miss E slid easily into the seat on the left, but I hesitated, wanting to soak it all in. The small space packed with gauges, switches, and levers, the windows offering a cropped view of the world beyond, and the low curve just above my head. I grumbled about a ride in the back seat of our car, yet Miss E had flown around the world in this tiny space. She patted the seat beside her, and I wiggled in. Once there, I felt more at ease. The old leather seat was worn and soft. My legs and feet fit neatly under the control panel, and my new position offered me more headroom and a better view out the windows. Do you, I hesitated, do you ever fly it? After I spoke, I wished I could put the words back into my mouth. Something about sitting in a plane that had been lost to the world for 30 years made me feel like it wasn't my place to speak, and I should be a silent observer, like sitting at the grown-up table during a fancy dinner. But Missy only smiled. You ever hear a Lockheed Electra during takeoff? She said. I shrugged my shoulders and shook my head at the same time. Those two WASP engines were designed before anyone thought up the idea of noise pollution. Half the county would be looking out their windows and stepping into their front yards, trying to figure out what was making all the noise. And then they'd be craning their necks to watch it fly over, looking like no plane they've ever seen. Before I got 500 feet off the ground, the controllers at that airport would see me with their fancy radar screens out of the middle of the cornfields. Next, they'd be looking for my transponder signal, which they wouldn't find. I must have looked confused because Miss E paused and raised her eyebrows in a questioning way. Transponder? It's a special radio that every plane these days needs to have. All the while you're in the air, you're sending out your identification, what direction you're going and how fast, so the controllers in the tower and the other planes around know what you're up to, and everyone can stay out of everyone else's way. But the Electra was made long before transponders, so they'd have an unidentified aircraft, and that would really get their dander up. They'd watch me on radar, and wherever I landed, there'd be a welcome wagon. By the time the evening news came on the TVs, everyone would be talking about that old lady who climbed out of that antique aircraft. And gosh, don't that plane look just like the one that Earhart woman flew. And what year was that? And how old would she be today? We sat in silence for a moment while Missy's words sunk in. My eyes scanned the gauges and controls in the plane and then moved up toward the windows. I looked out again through them to the scene beyond, and the barn door seemed smaller than ever, as if the plane's wings would hit the sides before it ever made it out the opening. So, you're stuck here? I finally said. Yep, I suppose I am. This plane's stuck here leastways, and I'm not really going anywhere without it. Missy let out a sigh, and then sat staring out the windows. I let her sit in silence, and then she spoke again. This barn and this field have been here long before they built the airport, so I suppose it's just a coincidence. Coincidence that I ended up here too. But sitting here in this barn, looking out those doors at that field beyond, that long field, never saw a field so flat. I remember landing on it when I came here, so smooth I thought I was on pavement. It'd be perfect. And it all lines up with that runway in Oakland just 50 miles away. Took off from there 30 years ago, and it just sits out there every day, so close I could hit it with a thrown stone. Another long pause, long enough that I had a question on my lips when Miss E started speaking again. Around the world minus 50 miles. I come out here and I sit and I look at those last miles of my world flight, 50 miles, just waiting to be flown. Be an easy flight, especially with things all lined up so nicely. We'd get out to the end of this field rising above those trees, and we'd see the city. Wouldn't be but a few minutes, and we'd see those fancy airstrip lights they have out there now. This Electra could practically do the flight. This Electra could This Electra could practically do the flight like that by herself. I felt the gravity of what Miss E was saying way down the cockpit, and the excitement of being in the plane started to sour when I realized what it meant to her. To me, the plane was a discovered treasure and a thrilling secret, something the world thought was lost that I had found. To Miss E, it was an unfinished goal, a reminder of a journey and a life that hadn't turned out as planned. Without warning, one of the plane's engines thundered to life. I turned to see Miss E's hand on a switch. She flipped another switch, and the second engine coughed twice and then roared. "What are you doing?" I shouted, and she said something back, but I could hear nothing over the sound of the engines. Miss E scanned the gauges and then started working the controls. I could see her feet moving the rudder pedals on the floor, and her hands push the yoke away from her and then pull it back again. She looked out the side windows at the flaps on the wings and then watched them move up and down as she turned the yoke side to side. She sat back in the seat comfortably, but her eyes were focused on the horizon. Her hands held the yoke lightly, not moving it much, as if she were keeping the plane level and flying a steady course. I sat watching her face, and when she smiled, she became Amelia Earhart. She wasn't wearing the funny hat with the goggles or the jacket with the fur-lined collar that everyone would recognize from the magazine pictures, but if I held up the picture hanging in my history classroom next to Miss E at that moment, they would have been twins. The smile seemed to change her whole face, made her eyes twinkle and her hair curl. Now, the sour face that she wore into town made sense, because the moment Miss E smiled like that at anyone, they would have rushed off for sure, shouting that they'd just seen Amelia Earhart. The roar of the engines grew, and I looked down to see Miss E's right hand moving a lever that I figured was the throttle. She moved it back and forth, and the engines revved up and then fell back to an idle. Each time, she seemed to let the engines rev a little longer until she took her hand off the throttle and let them continue to run at that high speed. The plane shuddered with the engine's energy, and the very air around us seemed to vibrate. Their sound filled the cockpit until there was nothing else, and I gripped the seat beneath me, sure that any second we would spring from the ground in a tremendous leap. It was simply impossible to imagine that much power sitting motionless in the barn. And then they stopped. The propellers still spun blurred circles, and the engines coughed, the one on my side sputtering to life again for a second before the fuel in the pistons was used up. Then it was silent. I stared at Miss E, eyes wide, mouth open. My initial surprise at the engine starting now turned to wonderment that we were still on the ground. The smile was gone from her face, and she was slumped back in her seat, her gaze still out the windows, but in a dreamy way, the intensity gone, not like she was living it, but only wishing it. I couldn't help but break the silence. "What happened?" I half shouted, still compensating for the now silent engines. My voice brought Miss E back to the cockpit, and she raised her eyebrows in a question. "The engines, you started them up. I thought, well, you said about the airport. I thought we were..." Miss E straightened up, and her expression returned to normal. "Got to turn these old engines over every month or so. Leave them just sitting here and they'll seize. Won't ever start again if that happens. I suppose people are about the same way, huh, Bets?" She pulled herself and then leaving it to close the barn doors. I stood in the now too bright sunlight and once again let Miss E struggle with the doors rather than helping her. I could do nothing but watch the image of the plane in the barn slowly get shut inside. One door closed and then the other until there was just a sliver of light getting through, one beam falling on the metal skin of the plane, and then nothing. "Well, you've seen my Electra," Miss E sighed and closed the lock on the doors. She walked off toward the house, and I knew it wasn't my place to follow. I stood where I was for a minute more, watching her leave and letting all she told me and all I'd seen sink in. On my ride home, my mind kept going back to what Miss E had said about those engines and how they needed to be started every month or so. 30 years is a long time to take care of engines that you know won't ever really be used again. I thought about how Miss E looked sitting in that cockpit with those engines running like that, and I was certain she didn't do it. She didn't even know I was there. She wasn't revving those engines and working the controls so I could see what the plane could do. She was doing it because every month for the last 30 years, she'd gone out to that barn and dreamed of flying that plane again. And I thought about how that plane was stuck there, a treasure, but at the same time, like a secret that had to be hidden away, one taking the shine off the other. Because after all, what good is a treasure if you can't ever show it to anyone or tell anyone about it or let it fly through the air like it was meant to do? All right. One last comment on that chapter. Reading that and thinking about the description of the Electra in the barn reminds me a lot. If you've ever been to the one of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museums, the one out in Virginia that has one of the space shuttles, that space shuttle was not ever really cleaned or restored. It looks like it looked the last time it flew into space. It's dirty, and the parts of it are charred from the heat of the re-entry. It looks like it has launched into space and orbited the Earth and come back to Earth. And that's what I thought of when I was describing that Electra, what it would look like if it had just been put in a barn after flying around the world. And I didn't, like Beth said, I didn't want it to be shiny and new. She would have been disappointed if it looked that way. I wanted to describe it as if it had just come back from this around the world flight. All right, so that is the reading for today. Hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully I will see you here next week.